What if everything you thought you knew about baseball's biggest rivalries was carefully orchestrated behind closed doors? What if the tension between superstars wasn't just competition, but something far more calculated? Because right now, while the world watches highlight reels and celebrates home runs, there's a shadow war happening in Major League Baseball that nobody's talking about. Secret meetings between front offices, backroom deals that could destroy careers, and one player whose silence might be the most dangerous weapon of all. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the biggest power struggle in baseball history. This isn't about stats or trophies. This is about control, loyalty, and the brutal reality of what happens when empires collide. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will completely change how you see America's pastime. The baseball world thought it understood the landscape after last season. Championships were won, awards were handed out, and everyone assumed the offseason would follow the usual pattern. A few trades here, some free agent signings there, maybe a surprise retirement or two. But what actually unfolded was something nobody predicted: a complete fracturing of relationships that had taken decades to build. And it all started with a conversation that was never supposed to leave the room. Sources close to multiple organizations have confirmed that immediately after the World Series, a series of emergency calls took place between general managers across both leagues. The topic wasn't about improving rosters or discussing trade targets. It was about something far more existential: how to compete in an environment where traditional rules no longer seem to apply. One executive, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the mood as borderline panic. Teams that had spent years building their organizations through smart drafting and player development suddenly felt like they were playing a completely different game. The financial landscape had shifted so dramatically that old strategies were becoming obsolete almost overnight. At the center of this upheaval is a reality that everyone knows but few want to say out loud. The competitive balance that baseball has tried to maintain for generations is breaking down. Not slowly, not gradually, but rapidly and irreversibly. Large market teams aren't just outspending smaller markets anymore. They're operating in an entirely different economic universe. The gap isn't measured in millions of dollars, it's measured in hundreds of millions, sometimes approaching $1 billion in total payroll commitments when you factor in deferred money and luxury contracts that stretch decades into the future. This creates a psychological problem that goes beyond just wins and losses. Players in smaller markets are watching their peers sign contracts that are literally 10 times larger than anything their own teams could ever offer. Agents are whispering in their ears about missed opportunities and wasted prime years. Front offices are stuck between trying to compete and accepting that their ceiling is fundamentally lower than teams in major media markets. The resentment isn't just growing, it's metastasizing into something that could genuinely threaten the fabric of the league. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Rather than address this openly, baseball has chosen to handle it through a series of unspoken agreements and strategic leaks. Certain executives have started coordinating their public comments to apply pressure on the league office. Others are feeding specific narratives to trusted journalists, trying to shape public opinion without directly confronting the issue. It's a cold war fought through press conferences and carefully worded interviews, and the targets of this campaign are obvious: the teams and players who represent the new reality that everyone else is struggling to accept. Take what happened after the MVP announcements last season. On the surface, it looked like typical sports controversy. One player expressed frustration, made some questionable comments, and faced consequences. But dig deeper and you find something far more complex. Multiple sources have indicated that the public outburst wasn't entirely spontaneous. There were conversations beforehand, encouragement from people in positions of influence, a sense that someone needed to say what many were thinking, even if it meant becoming a lightning rod for criticism. The player who made those comments became the face of frustration across baseball, not just his own frustration with finishing third in MVP voting, but a collective anger from players and teams who feel the system is rigged against them. His words resonated because they touched on something real, the sense that no matter how well you perform, no matter how hard you work, if you're not on one of a handful of elite teams, your ceiling is permanently capped. You can be great. You just can't be the greatest. That distinction is reserved for players who have the advantage of massive organizational support and unlimited resources. The response from other players was equally revealing. When asked about the controversy, most chose their words very carefully. They didn't defend the comments, but they also didn't completely condemn them. There was a recognition that while the delivery was poor, the underlying sentiment wasn't entirely wrong. Baseball has always had competitive imbalance, but something about the current era feels different, more extreme, more permanent, less about cyclical success where small market teams occasionally break through, and more about structural advantages that compound year after year. What made the situation even more volatile was how quickly it escalated beyond just baseball. Fans got involved in ways that crossed lines. Social media amplified every opinion into a full-blown movement. Agents started using the controversy to position their own clients. Media outlets discovered they could generate massive engagement by taking extreme positions on either side. Within 72 hours, what should have been a minor story about one player's disappointment had become a national conversation about fairness, capitalism, and the future of professional sports. MLB's response revealed just how seriously they viewed the threat. The sanctions weren't just about punishing inappropriate behavior. They were about sending a message that public dissent against the system itself would not be tolerated. The fines were significant, but the real punishment was symbolic. A clear statement that players need to stay in their lane. You can compete on the field, you can negotiate your own contracts, but you cannot question the fundamental structure of how the league operates. That's off limits. Behind the scenes, there were intense debates about whether the punishment went too far or didn't go far enough. Some executives argued that making an example was necessary to prevent others from following suit. Others worried that heavy-handed sanctions would only create martyrs and fuel more resentment. The compromise was a middle ground that satisfied nobody but allowed everyone to move forward without further escalation, at least temporarily. But moving forward doesn't mean the underlying issues disappeared. If anything, they've intensified. Teams are now more secretive about their strategies. Players are more careful about what they say publicly, but more vocal in private conversations. Agents are actively strategizing about how to position their clients for maximum leverage in an environment where only a few teams can truly compete for championships. The Cold War hasn't ended. It's just gone underground. One of the most fascinating developments has been the role of international stars in all of this. Players coming from leagues outside North America often have different perspectives on competitive balance and organizational loyalty. They're less invested in the traditional narratives that American players grew up with. They see baseball as a global business where the goal is to maximize their own value and win as many championships as possible. This pragmatic approach is reshaping how everyone thinks about team building and player movement. The influence these international players have in their clubhouses is also significant. They're not just teammates, they're often cultural ambassadors who help organizations recruit other international talent. When a star player from Japan or Latin America speaks positively about an organization, it carries weight that traditional scouting reports simply can't match. Teams have figured this out and are actively leveraging these relationships in ways that give them advantages beyond just financial resources. This creates another layer of competitive imbalance that's harder to measure, but just as real. A team that successfully integrates international stars gains access to a talent pipeline that others can't easily replicate. Language barriers decrease. Cultural adjustments become smoother. Players feel more comfortable taking risks on teams where they know they'll have support systems in place. Over time, this compounds into sustained advantages that go far beyond any single transaction. The other side of this equation is the growing frustration among players and teams who don't have these advantages. They watch competitors build international pipelines and wonder how they're supposed to compete. They see signing bonuses and contract structures that seem designed specifically to circumvent luxury tax penalties and competitive balance rules. They hear about back-channel communications between players across different teams and worry about collusion. The paranoia is real, even if the evidence is circumstantial. What makes this moment so critical is that baseball is approaching a decision point. The league can either acknowledge that the current system is creating unsustainable imbalances and make structural changes, or it can continue pretending everything is fine while the gap between haves and have-nots grows wider. Neither option is particularly appealing. Structural changes would require convincing powerful owners to accept limitations on their competitive advantages. Maintaining the status quo risks eventual revolt from players and smaller market teams who feel permanently disadvantaged. Some within the league have started floating ideas for reform: harder salary caps, more aggressive revenue sharing, restrictions on contract deferrals, limits on how teams can use international signing bonuses. Each proposal faces fierce opposition from different constituencies. Large market teams don't want restrictions on their spending. Small market teams don't want to share more revenue without guarantees it will be used to improve their rosters. The Players Association is skeptical of anything that might limit player earnings. Finding common ground seems nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the players at the center of these debates are trying to navigate an increasingly complex landscape. Superstars are weighing competitive advantages against financial maximization, against legacy concerns. Role players are trying to figure out if they should chase money or chase rings, knowing they might not get both. Young prospects are hearing conflicting advice about whether to prioritize development or immediate opportunity. Everyone is operating with incomplete information and making decisions that will define their careers. The psychological toll of all this is underappreciated. Players are constantly being compared not just to their peers, but to historical standards that may no longer be relevant. A great season that would have won MVP awards in previous eras now gets dismissed because someone else put up video game numbers in a more favorable situation. Individual achievements are contextualized to the point where nothing feels purely earned. Every success comes with asterisks. Every failure gets magnified through the lens of opportunity cost. This environment creates pressure that goes beyond normal competitive stress. Players are dealing with social media criticism that's immediate and relentless. They're navigating team dynamics where massive salary disparities can create tension. They're managing relationships with agents who sometimes have conflicting interests. They're watching their careers get dissected by analytics that reduce human performance to mathematical outputs. The mental health challenges are significant, even if most players would never admit it publicly. What happened after last season's awards were announced was a manifestation of all these pressures reaching a breaking point. One player's frustration became a focal point for much larger anxieties rippling through the sport. The reaction wasn't really about one individual's comments. It was about a system that's increasingly difficult to defend and increasingly hard to change. Baseball found itself confronting questions it's been avoiding for years, and the answers weren't comfortable for anyone involved. The aftermath has been a kind of forced peace. Everyone agreed to lower the temperature and move forward, but the underlying tensions haven't been resolved. They're still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the next trigger. Another massive contract, another dynasty team adding yet another superstar, another small market franchise trading away a beloved player because they can't afford to keep him. The cycle continues, and each iteration makes the eventual reckoning more inevitable. Some people believe baseball has always been this way. That competitive imbalance is baked into the sport's DNA, and trying to fix it is futile. Others argue that previous eras had natural limiting factors that no longer exist, geographic constraints that have been erased by modern travel, media revenue that was more evenly distributed, player movement that was more restricted. Whatever the historical reality, the present feels qualitatively different, more concentrated, more deterministic, less romantic. The question that nobody can answer is what comes next. Does baseball continue down this path until something breaks? Do players eventually organize around demands for more equitable competition? Do fans in smaller markets simply accept that their teams will never truly contend and adjust their expectations accordingly? Or does some external force, a new television contract, a change in ownership dynamics, a cultural shift in player priorities, create an opening for meaningful reform? Right now, we're in a holding pattern. Everyone is watching, everyone is waiting. The players who benefited from the current system are trying to extend their advantages while they can. The players who feel disadvantaged are looking for leverage to force changes. The league office is hoping the issue resolves itself without requiring difficult decisions. And fans are increasingly divided between those who celebrate excellence regardless of how it's achieved and those who mourn the loss of competitive balance they remember or imagine from earlier eras. This is the real story of modern baseball, not the highlights and championships, not the record-breaking contracts and Hall of Fame careers, but the quiet struggle over what the sport should be and who gets to decide. It's a battle being fought in boardrooms and clubhouses through press releases and anonymous quotes by people whose names you'll never know, but whose decisions shape everything you see on the field. And here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. This battle isn't close to being finished. If anything, we're still in the early stages. The forces pulling baseball apart are stronger than the forces holding it together. The economic incentives point toward more concentration, not less. The cultural momentum favors individual greatness over collective parity. The structural barriers to reform remain formidable. So buckle up, because the chaos we've seen so far is just the beginning. More controversies are coming. More players will speak out. More teams will push boundaries. More fans will demand answers. Baseball is heading somewhere, but nobody's quite sure where. The only certainty is that the journey will be turbulent, unpredictable, and absolutely fascinating to watch. If you want to understand where this sport is really going, forget the box scores and watch the power moves happening in the shadows. That's where the real game is being played. Subscribe and stay tuned, because this story is far from over, and the next chapter might be the most explosive yet.